Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the Life Sciences Ontario Fall Policy Symposium. My name is John Kelly, and I'm Vice Chair of Life Sciences Ontario. And I've had the privilege of working with a really excellent committee. It seems to be an excellent committee every year that we put this symposium on. So with that, there's lots of different challenges. I'd like to particularly call out Jason Field and First Stage for their yeoman's work in bringing this all together. They've done quite a lot of work. So when we come into a forum like this, you know, life sciences is a complicated business. It's very diverse, you know, and we seem to have increasing complexity in a push-button world. So people aren't understanding what it takes to do different things. We have a population that whose literacy in science, relative to the amount of complexity of the science that's going, is declining. So that puts us all in a difficult situation. How do we get our messages out? How do we set policy based upon a declining literacy of the population? We're seeing currently decisions being made that are based upon popularity or the running theme of the time. Life sciences is no different than many other areas in that regard. We need to have, I think, a fulsome discussion on policy, and that's what today is really all about. We're not really here to talk about the what of policy, because I think a lot of us have had those what decisions or discussions for a long time. We really want to talk about how we can implement, how we can change, how we can bring the best policies forward. And that's really, really significant. The potential of life sciences seems to get put into the background in Ontario because we have such a diverse economy. So when you look at life sciences Ontario doesn't look at life sciences just as a narrow area. It includes the breadth of life sciences, anything that has a living organism, if you will, associated with it. So it includes the pharma and the med tech, but it also includes the agriculture and the food and the forestry spaces. These spaces that contribute significantly to the economy, and we should be rising up and saying, yeah, this is a significant component of our economy. It's a growth part of our economy, and we need to be keeping focus on it. You'll notice that we have several panels here during the day, and what I'd like you to really take note of is some of the similarities across the panels when the discussions are being made. Whether it's an industrial biotech challenge or a med tech challenge, or you know, the way policy is done, you'll see some similarities across the way. And that's really why Life Sciences Ontario is as it is, working as one voice for all life sciences. When we look at policy, there's lots of different components to it, whether it's corporate policy, government policy, NGO policy. It could be Life Sciences Ontario policy for that matter. And we see variances across different areas. So if corporate policy doesn't jive with government policy, we see conflict. You can look at, I don't know, the Ministry of Finance versus the Ministry of Health, right? Those are internal government policies, but they impact corporate policy. What about the current one that's happening in agriculture, and that's the neonicotinoid controversy that's happening right now, or policy discussion that's happening now between OMAF and the Ministry of the Environment, moving forward with different policies. We have internal policies, so within a company, if you're a multinational, can you make decisions domestically without having the international component of it done or impacting what you do? If you're a small company, what about the policies that you have? What about policies of financing and regulatory affairs and all of those things that will impact your business? Domestically, we look at whether it's national policy, provincial policy. even down in some regards to municipal policy. We need to bring those to the fore. And then we have our international discussions, whether it's trade policy or investment policy or innovation policy. Where do we want to fit on all of these things? So it's going to be a great day. We've got some excellent speakers, excellent panels. I would like to call out any Life Sciences Ontario board members, if you can stand up, just so people know who you are. Right, so we've got a number here. So I encourage you, if you're not a member of Life Sciences Ontario, speak to these board members and ask them why they're part of Life Sciences Ontario, and I'm sure they'll be able to tell you pretty straight up. I'll remind you to turn your cell phones to silent. You don't have to turn them off. That's like, you can't tell people that. Washrooms are out to the left. I will remind people that there is a reception at the end of the day, so once you've heard all these discussions and you really want to talk to somebody, wait for the reception or at lunchtime or certainly during the question and answer period. But take that opportunity to introduce yourself to somebody that you don't know to find out more about Life Sciences Ontario and life sciences in Ontario. So we also will have an online evaluation which everybody here will be contacted to try and fill it out. So we're looking for feedback. We're looking for what you think the next best thing is for running these types of events. There are several note takers in the audience, me being one, and who are the others? Jason Lachlan. Is Allison coming today too? Okay, Allison Symington as well. And we will be developing a policy report coming out of this meeting, so you can look forward to that as it moves forward. Part of running these events is certainly getting support from different groups. And in your packages, you'll see that there are acknowledgement and thank you to the different sponsors, whether it's event sponsors like Alcon and Novartis Company, the City of Toronto, the Agritech Commercialization Center, which is excuse me, a combination of BioEnterprise, Soy 2020, and Ontario Agri-Food Technologies, Pfizer, Marsh, the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area. All of these groups have provided support. Platinum sponsors, RX&D, the City of Toronto, KPMG, Sanofi, Pasteur. So we really like to acknowledge and thank these people, because without those, we just couldn't put these events on, and they certainly are important. Then we have silver sponsors, Ernst & Young, Richmond Hill, and excuse me, Novartis as well. So, like I said, thank you very much for supporting the event. Our first speaker is Dr. Maurice Bertrand. Now, everybody has copies of the bios in the packages, so I'm not going to read the bios, but I will tell you that Maurice and I do have a personal connection. Some of you may recall that I used to run an organization called Mars Landing, and Maurice was a board member on Mars Landing. He was a very active board member, and we certainly sought his counsel when we were talking about different things, dealing either with provincial or federal policy, or with dealing with companies and new technologies and innovation policy. So Maurice is certainly an excellent candidate to talk on this topic. He also is a 2013 Life Sciences Ontario Public Service Award winner. So with that, will you join me in welcoming Maurice to the podium?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in Life Sciences Ontario Policy Symposium. I welcome Jason Field's invitation to speak to you today for two reasons. First, I think that Life Sciences Ontario is a model industry association that understands the interface between government and private sector better than most. And second, because this is an opportunity to have a dialogue in an area, in a topic that I think is really important, and that it needs more attention from science-based industry like yours. And that is the role of science in public policy. I'll try to be brief, so we'll have some time at the end to actually have a dialogue and some questions and answers. As Jason and others in the audience know, I have personally made the long and arduous journey from science to public policy. I trained and did research in physics and astronomy, and when I joined the Ontario government many, many years ago, I did it as a health physicist. However, I found myself slowly drifting towards policy. First, I worked on research and innovation policy, and eventually, I ended up leading the portfolios for economic development, trade, and environment policy. I wish I could say that that was part of a grand plan. It wasn't. It just kind of happened that way. And like my training in science, I did not study public policy or political sciences in university. So whatever I learned along the way was the result purely of trial and error. And I do have the scars to prove that. What I would like to do today is to share with you some of what I've learned and what I've observed using science in the crafting of public policy. From the point of view of the scientist, and also, is it working okay? Oh, sorry. And also from the point of view of the policymaker, and then draw some conclusions that I hope will be useful to you. I want to make it clear that this is just my personal perspective, not that of my employer or of any organization I may be associated with. Working in research funding policy, I heard several otherwise very clever researchers say, the problem is that politicians don't have a clue about science. If they knew anything about science, they'll see the importance of my research and they'll fund it. Well, it didn't take me very long to realize that while it is true that most politicians and policymakers don't know much about science, although there are some notable exceptions, such as our own Minister of Research and Innovation, a bigger problem is that most scientists don't know much about politics and policy making. And what is worse, they don't understand its importance. I think that this is at least partly an unfortunate consequence of the early specialization of our educational system. Most kids who decide in grade 10 that they're going to pursue a career in political sciences drop chemistry and physics, hoping never to see them again, unless, of course, they end up doing policy work in environment or natural resources or fishing or education or health. Conversely, most grade 10 kids who want to become scientists drop economics and political science, hoping never to see them again, unless, of course, they have to explain the social and economic impact of their research, present the benefits of a new drug or therapy to government, or communicate the risk of a new strain of bird flu to the public. This schism between science and the humanities is not a new phenomenon. The English scientist and novelist C.P. Snow, in his famous 1959 lecture, Two Cultures, argued that the intellectual life of the whole of Western society was split between two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, and that this was a major hindrance, to solving the world's problems. In spite of this warning, the split between science and humanities has only gotten worse since then. Instead of narrowing, the gap between science and the humanities gotten wider, to the point that today, practitioners of these two cultures seem to speak two entirely different languages. To make matters worse, while the gap was getting wider, the stakes were getting higher. Our society depends on science today more than ever before. Even our economy is known as the knowledge economy. The lack of communication between these two cultures is indeed a threat to our ability to resolve society's problems, many of whom have an important science component. The solution to this problem needs to be rooted on a new approach to education, particularly for scientists and policymakers. While this is well beyond the scope of what we can do today, we can begin to consider some observations that may help improve the situation. I have organized these observations into 5 groups. First, what scientists should know about policymaking. Second, what policymakers should know about science. Third, put forward a framework for policy decisions. Fourth, some considerations for the use of scientific evidence in policymaking. And lastly, some consideration for the development of science-based policy. So we'll start with what scientists should know about policymaking. At a minimum, I believe that scientists need to be clear on the following points about policymaking. The responsibility to present the state of the science on a particular policy issue in a fair and comprehensive fashion, and in non-specialist clear language, with appropriate information on its limitations and uncertainties, rests squarely with the scientists. Number 2, if you're presenting only the science that supports your point of view and dismissing the rest, you're acting as an advocate, not a scientist. There's nothing wrong with being an advocate. However, advocacy should not be cloaked with the impartial code of science. Number 3, many science-related policy issues are not scientific questions at all. They are value questions. Whether society decides to clone humans, create intelligent robots, or pay for in vitro fertilization will depend on the values that that society holds dear. These are value questions, informed by science to be sure, but decided by societal values, not science. Number 4, politicians need to take into account many variables in addition to science. This includes cost, public support, political support, who will be the winners and losers of the new policy, etc. And finally, in many cases, decisions need to be made very quickly, and there is no time to do more research. Now, what policymakers should know about science. I believe that policymakers at a minimum need to be clear on the following. Number 1, science is a cumulative approach to understanding nature, continuously perfectible but never perfect. Today's scientific truth will likely be challenged by future research. Still, science is the best tool we have to understand nature. Number 2, not all scientific studies should be given the same weight. There are good studies and not so good studies. You need to ask questions about sample size, statistical power, data limitations, confounding factors, statistical significance, etc. Number 3, correlation does not imply causation, but causation can be inferred under certain circumstances. Number 4, although you can always find scientists with opposing points of view, there is such a thing as a broad scientific consensus in many areas that remain politically controversial. Number 5, scientists are human beings. They have their own biases and opinions. It is important to distinguish between the science and the opinions. We could go on. The journal Nature has published articles on the 20 things that scientists need to know about policy making and the 20 things that politicians need to know about science. But from my own experience, the points I made about it would be a pretty good start. Now, a framework for policy decisions. I believe that an important piece to make good science-based policy decisions is to have a reference framework that incorporates the main elements of decision-making. During my fellowship at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto, I devised a simple framework to inform the discussions of a seminar course I taught on the role of science in public policy. In this framework, public policy decisions can be thought as being driven mainly by 4 variables: values, cost, knowledge, and timeliness. Values, where we as a society think it's important, for example, health, education, equal opportunity, etc. Cost, the best use of what is always finite resources. knowledge, the best available evidence for the issue at hand, and this includes scientific evidence. And timeliness is the imperative for early intervention. Now, values and costs seem to run counter to each other. We don't have enough resources to fund everything that we think is valuable to fund. And similarly, knowledge and timeliness tend to run counter to each other. Accumulated knowledge takes time, which runs counter, a timely intervention. So this would allow us to represent values and costs along one axis, and knowledge and timeliness along the other axis. And we can then situate policy decisions in this space, taking into account the relative importance of the drivers. So such a framework, whoops. But I need the slide now. The timing was perfect. It's just like 1 second I would have been. Oh, battery's low. Okay.
Want to take over there?
That's it, thank you. So that's what the framework would look like with values and cost effectiveness running kind of against each other, and then timeliness and knowledge. So the usefulness of this framework is to provide a relative estimate of the main drivers of a given policy, and to serve as an instrument to better understand the policies and its context. Depending on the relative importance of the drivers, policies can be thought of as falling in one of 4 quadrants: politically driven, philosophically driven, scientifically driven, or economically driven. And then decisions that have similar inputs from all of them can be thought of as balanced policy decisions, and they're the ones in the center there. Although balanced decision will generally be more desirable, there are circumstances where a policy mostly based on one of these dimensions is either necessary or desirable. All policies have these 4 ingredients in different proportions, and according to them, we can put them in these different quadrants. For example, and these are just examples, and people may disagree with the categorizing here. The banning of bisphenol A from baby bottles could be considered a quadrant 1 or politically driven decision. The value of protecting our young, coupled with the desire for a quick intervention, produce a policy decision with limited scientific knowledge or economic consideration. The provision of free public education could be considered a quadrant 2 or philosophically driven decision. The importance of education is being borne out by many, many studies, and it's become an important value in our society. We're happy to fund public education, so that would be a quadrant 2 or philosophically driven decision. An example of a scientifically or technically driven decision could be, for example, the fishing moratorium, which is based on the study of fish stocks, the effects of fishing on them, and their economic importance. And the introduction of the HST, the harmonized sales tax, can be considered a quadrant 4, mostly an economically driven decision. So we can use this framework to help us explore whether additional work in the areas less heavily weighted of a given policy might be necessary and make the policy more balanced or more acceptable to stakeholders, and thus reducing its implementation risk. This framework also serves to illustrate the role of science in relation to other important variables in policymaking. It is clear that science is not the only, or sometimes even the most important driver. You can place your favorite policy or pet policy peeve in this framework and perhaps get a better understanding of the drivers that shaped it. With the framework in place, we'll now move to some considerations for the use of scientific evidence in policymaking. That's my 4th group. As a scientist putting forward evidence for policymaking, the following considerations I believe are important. First, what is a societal problem the new development, drug therapy, procedure, etc., is aiming to solve? Number two, how big is that problem? And what is its cost to society? Number three, what is the evidence that the new development will solve the problem? How strong and well established is the evidence? What are its limitations? Number four, what are the alternatives and what are the pros and cons? What has been done elsewhere and what is the cost of doing nothing? Number five, who is going to be affected and how? In summary, what is the scientific and economic case for enduring public value from the proposed policy? Now I'll go to my last group, which is the consideration for the development of science-based policies. And this really is a general list of considerations for policymaking, and you'll see that science is just a part of it, but in policymaking you have to consider many other factors. So in a sense, the consideration for science-based policies are not different from the crafting of policy in general. And they include, as some of the main parts, the political and fiscal context. For the political context, you need to know the answers to the following questions. Number one, what is the relation of the proposed policy to the government's agenda? Is the policy part of the platform, throne speech, budget? Is it consistent with the policy agenda? Number two, what are the benefits of the policy? Are they demonstrable and quantifiable? What would be its negative effects? This is the main point that is informed by science. Here's where the scientists should show that there is solid scientific evidence that demonstrates the public value of the proposed policy. Number three, who would be the potential supporters and detractors of this policy? How would they be affected? How engaged are the different stakeholder groups? How politically active are they? Number four, what would be the public and political support for the policy? Is this a new and controversial policy? Or is it something that is being easily implemented and accepted in other jurisdictions? Number five, what would be the political cost and benefits of the policy? Would implementation of the policy require more political capital than what the government is able to risk at this time? Just as importantly, what is the fiscal context? That was the political context, now the fiscal context. You need to know the answers to the following questions. What is going to be the full cost of the policy? Are there lower cost alternatives? Are there cost-sharing options, for example, public-private partnerships? Are there cost-spreading options, for example, phasing the policy over several years? Can it be financed with financing instruments like loans or better yet, loan guarantees? And number six, and perhaps more importantly, what is the opportunity cost? Are there other important policies where the use of the limited public resources would be better at this time? To conclude, in our science and technology-based society, science should play a larger role in the crafting of public policy. This requires that both scientists and policymakers have a better understanding of what each other brings to the process, including its strengths and limitations. This is an important piece of what should be a more comprehensive and ongoing dialogue between science and society. I believe this dialogue is becoming increasingly necessary for the stability and progress of our society, and I hope that these observations contribute to that end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and stay by the microphone. Yeah. If you have questions, can you please use the microphones because we are recording the session, so I wanted to make sure that we do that. And using a microphone, hopefully this one on. No, okay, I'll have to ask my question.
It's too early. By the way, I'm amazed so many people get up so early to talk about policy. So that's incredible.
Okay, so I'm going to start it off. I like the framework slide. What do you do when the relative weights of one particular component of that framework seems to be out of whack with the other ones. How do you deal with that type of situation?
As I said, sometimes the circumstances are such that timeliness rules. You have to have something by the end of the weekend. And I think the advantage of having a framework like this is that you can open the discussion on how comprehensive or how well supported the policy is. And you can say, well, yeah, you have a timely intervention, but what about values and what about knowledge and how about the economic considerations? So I think the reality of the policymaking world is that oftentimes you have to come up with policies very quickly. And if you have a tool that allows you to open the conversation of, so what about these other variables, I think it helps in that sense. It's not going to solve the problem, but I think it helps. And I think oftentimes people are really not even consciously aware how much, for example, values weigh on a policy decision. People kind of have a gut feeling this is good or bad, but I think if you are able to examine really what are the values in the society that impinge on the policy, then I think you're able to decide better whether the policy, the way it's crafted, will speak to those values or not.
John Solonenko from HTX. I really like that framework, and it would be great if everyone in all four quadrants all believed in that framework. One of the things that I find challenging is when the philosophical, scientific, and economically driven agendas are very much aligned, and the political agenda is somewhere else. And so the challenge for those of us working in those other three is to say, how can we get the attention of those in the political realm, and how can we make what we're doing relevant to their political agenda and have them value it so that in fact it becomes on the political agenda?
I think that politicians, in generally, they try to be in tune with the values of the society, because if they're not in tune with the values of the society, they don't last very long. And that's kind of what they do. They try to give expression to values that often are not that expressed. And by and large, they're pretty good about it. And so I think that it's important to have that dialogue. They put forward that what they believe is an implementation of how they see the world in that platform. Study that platform. Look at it carefully. Look at what are the openings of points of contact with the kind of policy that you're interested in. If one ignores all that and just tries to put forward the scientific merits of a policy, I think you have a harder time than if you go and say, you're interested in increasing the health of the population, containing the cost. Well, we are too. This is what this new policy or discovery would do, et cetera, et cetera. But if we are oblivious to the values side of the equation and just try to push the science because we're so persuaded that the science works, it's going to be tougher.
I have a question about how scientists communicate with
Not very well.
the bureaucracy. I agree. So what suggestions do you have for how scientists can improve their communication skills with policymakers?
Great question. I think that a lot of the future of good policy making rides on the ability of scientists being able to put forward, articulate these things. And so part of it is education. So that's why when I had this fellowship at the University of Toronto, I taught this course on the role of science and public policy, and I had people from policy and science background take it. I think this is an urgent need to have something like that. I looked at the 9 policy programs across Ontario, and only one of them had a science and policy course. None of it had a curriculum on it. I think there should be a curriculum on science and policy, and part of it, important part of it, would be the communication aspect. And we need to train both scientists to communicate and understand policy, and we need to train policymakers to understand the basics of science and write the right questions. So I believe it's really important. I put a proposal to have such program forward, but for whatever reason it didn't make it, so I'm doing something else now.
I wanted to get your opinion on the time point, the time period that we're in currently. Given your comment that urgency tends to stem or provoke action, when we're looking at youth unemployment, it's at an all-time high, and it's very much skewed to the science kids. When you look at the, in fact, underemployment of graduates, it's like 25%. It's pretty shocking. Last year, the number of IP applications was at an all-time low in Canada, which says to me that the scientific spirit is being very much challenged, especially for the future. I want to get your opinion. Is that your sense that we're running into a period of high urgency that action is required?
I think politically there's always urgency about something, and but I think that the urgency on this issue of lack of communication between the science world and the policy world, to me, is something that becoming more and more urgent. We'll get to a point where there will be, I think, bad decisions made because of this lack of communication. I think that there are a number of pressing issues out there that politicians need to turn their attention to. Youth unemployment is one of them, but also how we are developing, the new generations and teaching them about science and other things. And that's why I decided to go to work in the Ontario Science Centre, because I think we need to start early in the training of science and exposing people to science. But the problem of youth unemployment is as much an economic problem that a science and policy problem.
Last question.
I agree with everything that you said so far, and I think that
My
was a
work is
wonderful
done.
talk. One more question, please. So basically, I think that you talked about scientists and policymakers being very important in policy making. I think that there might be another kind of silent driver, which is the general public. And very often, we see a lack of communication or communication barriers that occur between scientists and the general public, especially when scientific information gets disseminated completely wrong to the general public. And in turn, there isn't that connection between policymakers, general public, and scientists. And what are your thoughts on that? And how does the general public play a role in policy making?
Great question. I think there are a number of ingredients to that. One of them is science literacy, and again, the teaching of science from early on, and valuing the role of science. A journalist asked me the other day whether we have a science culture in Canada. And I said, I don't think so, not in the sense that we have a hockey culture. We have a hockey culture. People, get up at 6 in the morning to take their kids to hockey. We don't have anything like that related to science. And that's what really would be needed for society to take a more active, interested role in science. But that's only one part of the issue. I think that there is a total responsibility on scientists to take the results of their work and boil them down to understandable, clear language, non-specialist information. If the scientists don't do that, somebody else will do it, and somebody else who doesn't have the knowledge of it. And so it's the simplicity on the other side of complexity. It's not the simplicity before dealing with the complexity. And the people who can go through that complexity and boil it down to simplicity on the other side are the scientists. And they have to accept the responsibility to do that. Of course, it's going to simplify things. It's not going to talk about all the intricacies of the science, but you will have something that you will be able to communicate to the public and to policymakers. So I think every part of the equation has a responsibility. I think policymakers also have a responsibility to ask the right questions, to get the right people to advise them, and to also be open and transparent with the public. I think there is a danger that the public is being left behind here, not only on the science side, but also on the policy side.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Maurice for his presentation.
Thank you.
Token of appreciation.
Thank you very much.